Joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And thank you for being here today on our Tuesday live stream. This is a live stream that we host every week to cover all things related to digital transformation, the people, process, technology, strategy, change side of things. So thank you for being here. As I mentioned, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment. But today's topic is going to be the fallacies of ERP software and digital transformation. So we're going to cover some of the common misconceptions and myths about ERP software and some of the things related to transformation and implementations as well. This interview, if you haven't been on this live stream before, this live interview becomes part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is released every Wednesday. So the episode featuring this interview will be released next week on Wednesday of next week. So thank you for being part of our live production of the podcast here today. We're streaming to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So if you have questions on any of those platforms, please feel free to jump in, chime in with questions and comments along the way for either myself or our guests. And before I introduce our guest to talk about this topic here today, I encourage you, if you could, please just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. Where in the world are you? What city, what country are you in? It's always fun to see where the global digital transformation audience is joining from here today. So if you don't mind, just drop that in the chat for us wherever you're listening or watching. And you can use that same chat function, by the way, to ask any questions you have along the way as we get started. So again, our topic here today is the fallacies of ERP software and digital transformation. And with me joining us today is Darren Roos, who is the CEO of IFS Software, which is an ERP software provider. Darren, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's good to be on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. You're a first-time guest, and I really appreciate having you here. And excited to have you here today, largely because you have such a broad and diverse background in this industry. And I think you have some really good insights for us related to that. But maybe before we jump into some of the questions that we all have for you, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll come back and ask you a little bit more about IFS as well.
Sure. So my name is Darren Roos. I've been doing this enterprise software gig for going on 17 years now. Originally from South Africa, as you can hear from my accent, although I've been in the UK now for 12 years. And over the last 12 years, I've worked for 3 companies. First into my career was with Software AG, German middleware software company, you probably know. And then I did 4 years with SAP, ultimately running the global cloud ERP business. And then I've been CEO at IFS for the last 5 years.
Great. Yeah. So that you see, you've grown up in the space as well, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of interesting developments that we'll kind of cover here today as we talk about trends in the future of the enterprise tech space. But tell us a little bit about IFS Software for those that haven't heard of the technology or just aren't familiar with the company. Maybe tell us a little bit about the company.
Yeah, so IFS is an enterprise software company. We focus on customers in the upper mid-market and enterprise space. And we sell a set of solutions that are very focused on asset and service-centric industries. So thinking anything that has a bunch of assets or a lot of service. So it could be oil and gas, construction, telco, engineering, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. And the solutions that we sell are predominantly clustered, I would say, into 3 categories, which the traditional analysts would recognize as ERP, field service management, and enterprise asset management. But really, why we're as successful as we are is really in the intersection of those 3 things, because we provide ERP, EAM, and FSM on a single platform. So for those of you that do know us, you'll know that we're the Gartner Magic Quadrant leader for field service management. We're a leader for asset management. And in our asset and service-centric industries, we're also a leader for ERP. So it's really our ability to give customers the best of each of those capabilities as it relates specifically to their industry that has been such a big contributor to our success. We're just over $1 billion in revenue. And we have been around for over 30 years. But yeah, that's IFS in a nutshell.
Great. And
Eric had warned me that he might drop off, so I'll just carry on talking until he rejoins. And
the key Oh, you're back. We lost you for
You,
a second
you,
there.
you dropped off, Eric, but you're back.
One of us dropped. I don't know. Hopefully the audience can still hear us okay.
No problem.
Um, I was going to say the one of the interesting things about IFS that we'll get to throughout this discussion is that the product has a lot of strengths that are the weaknesses of other ERP systems and a lot of sort of edge capabilities and industry specific functions. So we'll get to that here in a second. But before I do that, though, actually, before I dive into anything ERP related or digital transformation related, I just have to ask you a question on a maybe more of a personal level. You're also the co-founder of a nonprofit called Inner Wings, which you and I didn't talk about this as we were prepping for the discussion, but I saw it on your LinkedIn, and I thought, you know what, I want to ask you about that because it sounds really interesting, and I'd just love to hear more about just what is Inner Wings and sort of what is your involvement there with the nonprofit.
So, it's a passion project that my wife and I started a couple of years ago, and I think some of you may or may not know my wife. She's the CEO of SUSE, the open source company, Melissa.
Oh.
And Melissa and I started the charity a couple of years ago. And I think growing up in the enterprise software space, we see that it's super difficult for women. And we see the disparity from a gender equality perspective. So we started Inner Wings. And what Inner Wings does is it really focuses on addressing the gender bias topic in young girls, aged kind of 6 to 12 years old. And what we know from science is that 6 to 12 year age gap or group rather is where the stereotypes are kind of embedded. So Inner Wings goes into schools. We do a bunch of work with schools in a number of countries focused on getting young girls to recognize that they can do anything, be anything that they want. They don't have to be nurses and flight attendants. They can be doctors and pilots. And that's the work that Inner Wings does. And we're immensely proud of what we do. And that's Inner Wings.
Very cool. Yeah, so you're more than just an enterprise tech guy. You're also giving back to the community and doing some passionate things on the side as well.
Absolutely. And we have 3 kids, and one of which is a young girl. And I think you see the disparity, and most of your listeners will have kids, and they'll recognize that challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, that's super interesting. And just as a side note, if someone wanted to learn more about Inner Wings, where would they go? Do you have a website or something that they could go check out?
Go to innerwings.org. Absolutely. And we'd love them to.
Right. Absolutely. Well, good. Well, so shifting gears then back to the digital transformation and sort of the topic here today of the fallacies of ERP software and digital transformation. Just sort of transitioning into that conversation, I guess maybe to start, let me back up for a second. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is not only because you're the CEO of a prominent software company here in the space, but also because the type of software that IFS provides is quite a bit different than other ERP vendors, and it sort of provides just a different approach to enterprise technology. And you yourself you're not only the CEO of IFS now, but as you mentioned, you also worked with SAP and Software AG. I think you had some time in Acumatica as well.
Yes.
So you've worked with multiple solutions throughout the years, and I guess I'd be curious to hear, how is IFS different from other ERP solutions in the marketplace, or how would you consider it different from those systems that you've worked directly for and with, and other systems as well?
Yeah, so I sat on the board of Acumatica for a while when EQT, who was a private equity firm that owned IFS, when they acquired Acumatica, I sat on the board during the acquisition phase, and then I also sat on the board of Sitecore, just as an aside. So I've been in the space for quite a while, and I think when I came to IFS coming out of SAP, what I recognized was that there was definitely a gap where customers wanted to not have to face this difficult challenge between best of breed, where they could find a solution that had the functional depth that they wanted, and best of suite, where they could get something that was integrated and would give them the benefit of an integrated solution. And for a long time, with the discussion around composable ERP, customers have been, told that they have to choose between these two things. You can either have the functional richness, or you can have an integrated solution. And the reality is that there is another dimension, a dimension where you can get the functional richness and the integrated capability, but then the software vendor has to compromise by being industry focused. And that's effectively what IFS has done. So when you look at our competitive landscape or our peers, then the likes of Oracle or SAP or Microsoft, They all provide horizontal ERP solutions where they're catering for a very broad subset of industries. All of the industries are served. And the reality is that when you're building a solution, an enterprise business solution that needs to be deployed in a bank and a healthcare provider and a manufacturer, then there's going to be a lot of capability that is just surplus to requirement, or capability that's not there. And then, that then falls on the ecosystem to try and build it bespoke for the customer. But when you're building an ERP that is only for industries where your capability is required, in other words, these asset and service-centric industries that I mentioned, then we're able to build capability that enables them to get the best of breed, but in an integrated solution. Single data model, single UX, no disparate databases and release cycles to deal with.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the interesting things about IFS is that it, as you mentioned, it's not trying to be everything to everyone. It's focused on specific industries, specific functions. And I think that really is a key differentiator, because you look at SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, just to pick on a few, vendors in the space, they are trying to be everything to everyone, and you're just going to get a watered down solution, especially if you're in a highly complex or unique industry like a field service or asset intensive sort of industry that you mentioned.
Well, I think what's tended to happen then over time is that customers tend to then stick with them for a subset of the capability. So, I don't think that too many people would argue that SAP's finance solution is a compromised functional solution. They have fantastic capability, and if they sold, FS finance standalone, then it would be a best of breed finance solution.
Right.
And I think that that's effectively what's happening now, is that customers are then choosing to exploit this composable enterprise option by then taking a bit from their horizontal ERP provider and then going out and buying best of breed apps that then will make their full function solution. Now, the challenge with that scenario is that if you're if you're Volkswagen or BASF, or you're a very, very large company and you have thousands of people in IT, then that's okay, because the integration and the complex release cycles and critically securing those disparate applications is something that you have the capacity to do. But if you're an organization with 500 million in revenue, or $1 billion in revenue, or 2 billion in revenue, you probably only have a couple of hundred people in IT. And then you don't have the capacity to do that. And unfortunately, the industry has sold this idea that with APIs and with native cloud integration, that you can just plug them in and it'll just work.
Right.
And unfortunately, for anybody who's done an SAP project with Salesforce or Workday or Coupa and try to just plug them in using a native cloud integration vendor, they'll know the reality of that scenario.
Right. Yeah. And that's something you and I have talked about too, is that, in this space, even vendors that are selling or alleging to sell integrated solutions, really those solutions oftentimes are not as integrated as they seem. And that's something we see a lot, like with SAP recently, with their over the last decade or so, with their acquisition minded approach. They've gone out and acquired SuccessFactors and Ariba and other point solutions that are third-party solutions, but it just so happens that SAP owns them, but they're still not integrated solutions with S/4HANA, their core flagship product. And other vendors are doing the same sort of thing. Is that something you're seeing, or is that something you're trying to counter with IFS's strategy? Or
well, I think at the end of the day, I just put my customer hat on, and I think that there are a bunch of customers for which SAP is absolutely the right solution. But there is a group of customers where perhaps they would want the benefit of the integrated solution, and then obviously they're struggling with the reality of when SAP bought Concur, or they bought Ariba, or they bought Fieldglass, or they have S4. All of those have invoicing capability, as an example. And then where do you do the invoicing from?
Right.
How do you navigate that complexity? And that's just the reality. But as I say, there are a bunch of customers that is okay. That doesn't matter, because they do have the capacity to solve that complexity. But where IFS is in our sweet spot is in that customer who is saying, I need a robust HR solution. I don't need Workday or SuccessFactors. I need a strong solution. and IFS has that. And I need a strong, solid CRM solution. I don't need Salesforce.com, and IFS has that. And I need my procurement and my distribution, my transportation management, my finance. I want all of those things, but I don't want to have to worry about the integration. I want it in the cloud, and I don't want to have to deal with users facing different user interfaces. I don't have to worry about the integration. I don't want to worry about managing different databases and so on. And that's the sweet spot for us. And it's a much greater level of functional depth than any of our peers provide. So it's not what a Microsoft or somebody like that would do. And we focus. There's a question, I can't help but answer it. Ghassan from Kuwait has asked what industry. So aerospace and defense is a big industry for us. It's our single biggest industry. Energy and utilities, construction and engineering, manufacturing, and then service industries like engineering and telco and so on.
Right. Yeah. Great question. I was getting ready to cue that up, so you beat me to the punch there. And speaking of our audience too, by the way, just before I get to some follow-on questions from that comment you just had, Darren, I just want to turn to the audience here and sort of acknowledge where a lot of people are joining from here today. We have Ghassan from Kuwait, Sam from Spain, Ryan from Denver, Malcolm from the UK, Zishan from Pakistan, TJ from Wisconsin, among others, Chris from Dublin. We have Third Stage Consulting Group on the line as well. Another person from Kuwait, Sultan from Oman. So just a few examples of where people are joining from today. It's always interesting because I feel like we get, even though I'm based in the United States, we don't get as many people from the United States as we do elsewhere in the world. So it's great to see such a global audience here today for the discussion. So you just answered the question that I was going to have, which was the vertical, which industry verticals does IFS focus on? I guess to shift gears though and look at the overall enterprise tech space, you've talked about this sort of what do you call it? The dichotomy between the single ERP systems and the more focused point solutions, and I think what we're covering here today, or what we're seeing in other vendors such as IFS, is that you're covering that middle ground. It's sort of like you're not a best of breed provider, but you're not a one size fits all, trying to be everything to everyone sort of solution. You're sort of in that middle ground. Is that a fair summary of where you see yourselves?
Yeah, I think that if it was a Venn diagram, you'd have proponents of best of suite only. You'd have proponents of best of breed, and I like to think that the solutions that we provide, specifically in the area of field service and enterprise asset management, are the two best solutions on the market. So there is no better field service management solution, and there is no better enterprise asset management solution. If you look at the industries that we serve, they're all industries where enterprise asset management and field service management are really critical to the success of those organizations. So, yes, absolutely. In that intersection of the two.
Okay, great. So overall then, what do you see as some of the biggest trends that are emerging in the enterprise tech space?
It's interesting because when I read it, I thought, there's obviously been a huge shift to the cloud. And in fact, I think Sam asked the question, does that mean that everything has to move to the cloud, or is it a fallacy that everything has moved to the cloud? And I'll answer the question at the same time, which is absolutely, we do not believe that everything should move to the cloud. I think that there are use cases which lend themselves really well to the cloud, and customer situations are all very different. And actually, IFS's philosophy is that we provide a solution which is called IFS Cloud, but it can be deployed as a remote option, which is effectively an on-prem instance. And then what we do is that we update that on-prem instance like it is in the cloud. So a customer can put it in their own environment. They can put it into a system integrator's environment. They can put it onto a hyperscaler, and we update it like a normal cloud application, but run as a remote instance. And so we're a big believer in a hybrid cloud and giving customers that choice. So I think the cloud is obviously a trend that continues, but I think a much greater practicality around what should be in the cloud and what shouldn't, and the role that hybrid cloud plays. And then obviously we see a continued move towards automation. We continue to see a huge push towards greater analytics, and in times like today, whether it's supply chain visibility or customer visibility, analytics and data is so important. But actually, the thing that struck me, Eric, when I was reading that question, was just how the fundamentals of what customers are looking for hasn't changed at all.
Right.
And at the end of the day, what they're looking for, and having spoken to many customers in my 17 years of doing this, is that they're looking for solutions that are, let's take functional capability as a ticket to the game. The solution has to be able to do it. That's important. But it has to be easy to use. It has to be easy to deploy, and it has to have a lower total cost of ownership, or an improved value ROI. And ultimately, that's what we continue to push to do, is to try and make it easier to deploy, make it easier to use for users, and focus on bringing down that total cost of ownership. And in the enterprise application space, that is evergreen, right? That's the holy grail. And unfortunately, it's not a destination; it is a continuum. And we continue to focus on that. And it's interesting because so many vendors continue to talk about artificial intelligence, and they continue to talk about augmented reality, and they continue to talk about a bunch of technologies, which, in my opinion, those technologies just have to be embedded in the application. Customers don't want to hear about another thing that they need to buy that gets added on. They just expect us as vendors to make it available, and we should just make it available, but we should always be striving to focus on those three things, I believe. So easier to use, easier to deploy, lower total cost of ownership. And that is, for 17 years, that's what customers have been telling me is most important to them. And that hasn't changed at all.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you say that. And I was actually, as you were describing that, I was thinking, it sounds so simple, so easy, so basic. But I think a lot of software vendors and industry consultants, I think we miss that a lot. Like, let's not worry about AI and augmented reality and the metaverse and blockchain and all that stuff quite yet. Let's just get the fundamentals down and let's figure that piece out. And then we can sort of, from there, layer on some of the more advanced emerging technologies. But a lot of times we want to go backwards.
Just to be clear, I think that as we engage with our customers and our partners on, where do we take the product and what do we do, making sure that emerging technologies become embedded is a critical part of our development lifecycle. If you look at what IFS has released over the last few years, we have significant examples of all of those technologies in use by customers today. But that's not that isn't what the talk track is about, because ultimately the customer wants to understand how they're going to be able to tangibly derive value from it. But too many vendors have for too long become more focused on how are they going to convince their customers to take advantage of those things while neglecting the really important things which customers are worried about. So you're right. I think not often enough are we focused on those things.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, the whole thread that we were just talking about, this is another question from Ghassan. And by the way, Ghassan is one of our regulars on this live stream, and I'd say he's a tough crowd. He's not an easy person to please. So this is pretty glowing praise from him, I'd say. But he says he worked with IFS for 10 years, thumbs up to Sweden for the innovation built into IFS. And I guess I want to maybe counter what you just said, which is, you focus on the basics, get the automation in place and sort of some of the more fundamental, less sexy sorts of approaches to technology. How do you balance that, though, the core fundamentals with providing innovation and sort of pushing the boundaries and the capabilities of the software? What's been your approach, or what have you seen work there?
Again, it comes back to focus. And I think that when we, I was on the board of another software company for a while, and I unashamedly stole this idea from them of being really, the term they used was customer-driven innovation. And a lot of vendors talk about customer-driven innovation, but the reality is that 80-90% of the ideas that they come up with come from their own engineering teams. And that's something that I've really focused on us not doing, where we've really brought rigor to how do we ensure that what we're building is what our customers are asking us for, and making sure that we're effectively crowdsourcing that requirement. And then you don't end up with a situation where a large proportion of what you're building sounds great to the engineering folks that built it, but actually the customer is going, but I don't need this function. And that's very, very common. And I can tell you, I've seen in many of the companies, I've only worked in 3 now, but they acquired companies where that was a disease almost, where customers would be complaining about system reliability and uptime, while hundreds of new functions that nobody was using were being released. And that's a very unhealthy situation, but one that's very common.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think that's the key is that, really understanding what your business needs are, your requirements, what are your goals and objectives as an organization, and how can technology fit into that. And I think too often we look for that silver bullet. We turn to the sexy technologies thinking if I just deploy AI and machine learning, that's going to make my business better. Well, it may be, but it's not going to if you don't get that core fundamental stuff in place, like just basic automation and integrated workflows and all that good stuff.
And it is, look, I don't want to make it sound like we're, we get it perfect. We equally struggle with this. Look, at the end of the day, we have 3,000 odd customers around the world, 3,000 enterprise customers. While we are very focused on those industries that I highlighted before, and a lot of the processes are common, the way in which they think about assets and the service of those assets is common. You still have divergent requirements, and finding the compromises on how you take care of them is particularly important. I think the biggest challenge in our world is, when you have a customer that says, I know someone who's done a service management or an ERP project with you. They were super happy. We'd like to talk to you about it. And we have to say, well, look, actually, you're a retailer. And the answer is no. That's not a path we're going to go down. That tends to be the biggest challenge for my teams. But, we stay modest, we stay humble, and just focus on trying to be the best that we can in the space that we're in.
Right. Now, we've talked quite a bit, and we actually on this podcast, by the way, have talked quite a bit about this whole debate of, single ERP system versus multiple solutions or best of breed. In fact, just in last week's podcast episode, which is episode number 102, we had a guest on who was talking about best of breed and sort of the pros and cons of that approach. So if you haven't listened to episode 102, just go back to Transformation Ground Control episode 102, and you can hear that full discussion. But I would love to hear as a follow-up to that, even though you may not have heard that conversation, what do you see as the biggest pros and cons of single ERP software versus the more composable ERP or the best of breed ERP?
I think the challenge comes when customers are trying to, go down the route of capturing the benefit of a best of breed solution, but without understanding the complexity of what that fragmented landscape is going to bring. And I think that unfortunately, and I think somebody asked the question earlier about, how do you counteract this? But vendors are going to tell you this is easy. They're good. And we've had loads of cases where a customer will buy. They'll go, I don't want to throw a specific vendor under the bus, but they'll buy a traditional best of breed solution for procurement or HR or CRM, who the vendors are. And then they'll select IFS as the ERP. And then they'll say, okay, now you IFS need to integrate to this vendor. And we go, but hang on, we're 80% of the landscape. They're 20% of the landscape. Why are you asking us to do this? And the answer is because that vendor does not have an answer. And now when they do that, that's okay, because we are architected to be able to do that, and we are used to working with other vendors in that way. But the problem is that when they go best of breed HR, best of breed procurement, best of breed contingent labor, best of breed procurement, and then a customer with a relatively small IT department is then faced with the challenge of how am I going to get this to work together? I mean, that's a disaster. And we see a lot of those. And we've been into a bunch of customers where we've gone in and they've had a fairly fragmented landscape, a couple of those best of breed vendors, and then they end up taking them out and replacing them. But that's a huge expenditure that, and time to value that they've wasted. So I think that's probably the most common mistake that I see. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And how do you, if you're a buyer, if I'm an enterprise tech buyer, I'm on an evaluation team that's really considering some ERP systems that are going to be potentials for my organization. How do I see through that? How do I vet that out? That fully integrated, the false messaging, if you will, that the solution is fully integrated when it's not? How do I vet that out, or what are some tactics you've seen that
I
that
think
you've seen work?
references are so important, and I think taking the time to meet with the references, talk to them about the experience that they've had. The enterprise, your listeners will be savvy in this space. I was chatting to a customer of ours in the US, that builds pools. They're a very large US swimming pool manufacturer installer. And we were talking about the fact that when they put in a pool, the process is that they come to your home, they dig a bloody great hole. There's a huge pile of dirt, and for a while it's very messy. And unfortunately, there's no other way to build a pool. You know what I mean? Digging that hole and having the dirt there is just the reality. And unfortunately, enterprise business solutions, what we do, whether it's a very large integration project or a very large ERP project, they're a bit like that. There is a process where it's uncomfortable. And the organization, especially if you're going to do it well, where you want to drive fit to standard, you want to make sure that you're adopting the processes as they're intended, that process can be very uncomfortable for an organization. And there is no super simple, easy way to do it. It's going to be somewhat organizationally painful. And I think that just accepting that and finding a partner, and I use the word partner because you can't approach it as a vendor. You have to recognize this is a marriage. There are going to be compromises, puts and takes, and talking to references that describe that relationship. One in which they've partnered with the vendor, and when there have been challenges that they've solved them together, talk through those challenges, make sure that you're really exploring what worked, what didn't work, how did the vendor respond when things didn't go well. Because if you get on a reference call and the customer just tells you everything was perfect, that's not a real reference call.
Right. Yeah, you want to get to the gory details, the good, the bad, the ugly, all that stuff. And Ghassan has a good follow-up here is to sort of answer or build on the question of what are the advantages and disadvantages of best of breed versus single ERP. And he makes the comment that there's challenges to best of breed solutions that include integration and security and multiple versions of the truth. I think security is a really interesting one because that sort of exposes you to more vulnerabilities or more potential openings for an outside actor to hack into your systems. But any thoughts or comments on this comment here from Ghassan?
100%. I think I'm obviously the CEO of an enterprise software company and we build and sell and implement software, but I also run $1 billion business. And that means that I have 5,500 employees now, and a bunch of customers that I need to secure. And that means that I think about cybersecurity a lot. And there is no question that the more fragmented your landscape is, the more points of entry there are for bad actors. I think that, if you go back to, I don't know, 10 years ago, people used to think about shadow IT as a problem in the context of spend. But the reality is that, the problem now is security. And the threat of cybersecurity today is not that it will cost you some money. The threat is that it can absolutely destroy your business. And it doesn't matter who you are. Any business can be completely debilitated if that is not handled well. And there's no question that the more fragmented and disparate your IT stack is, the more applications you have, the more potential threats there are.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Here's a question from Sam Graham on LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I don't believe you and I have ever discussed this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Darren. But do many companies still see ERP and digital transformation as being technology projects?
It's interesting. I think that yes, there are still a bunch that see them as technology projects. I reviewed a prospect of ours this morning, where large company, very big digital transformation project, not a single executive involved in the project, which is astounding to me. And I think that the way companies should be thinking about it is that the idea that you would think about a digital strategy or a digital transformation strategy is actually a bit of a misnomer. There is just the strategy, because any
Right.
company today that is not thinking about their strategy with a digital enablement, they will not succeed. And I think that that's super, super important. So, definitely companies still doing it, Sam, as incredible as that sounds. And I tell you what, my comment to the team was, I think we need to think long and hard about whether we compete for this business, because if we are successful, the likelihood that it will fail is incredibly high. Right now, I'm not worried that we lose the business. I'm worried we win it, because if we win
Right.
this business and there is no executive ownership, no executive sponsorship on this project, it will fail. But we see
Right.
it still incredibly.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how great the software is, how well it's built, designed, deployed. If the executives aren't on board, that's going to be a recipe for
100%.
disaster. Um, and actually, related to that, this is a good question from Chris over on LinkedIn. Chris asks, "Are all software vendors so similar that the strength of the implementation is now the most significant difference?" You just talked about executive buy-in and how important that is during implementation, and how that can derail an implementation, even if you have great software. But in general, do you agree with this comment, or do you have any thoughts here? Or software vendors being similar, that it really just comes down to the implementation?
I think the statement has some truth to it, but with a very large caveat, which is we quite often are dealing with projects where, because of the asset and service nature of the customer, um, the statement all vendors have the capability to do this is just not factually accurate. And it's actually quite a dangerous narrative in that context specifically, because a bunch of vendors today just don't have that capability, especially when you're talking about vendors that have dealt predominantly with what I would call administrative ERP in the past. But
Mm.
there are a bunch of organizations who do require administrative ERP solutions, and at that point you're 100% right. Whether they, if you're I don't know, if you're an organization that doesn't have a bunch of assets and service centric requirements, or and you're looking for a solution, then yeah, it comes down predominantly to the implementation. I agree, and maybe not just the implementation, but I'm a bit, as you'll have heard from this, I'm a huge proponent of that vendor customer relationship. And I think, if you procure at arm's length, and you then find an implementation partner, and you try and go off and do this without the vendor's guidance to make sure that the application is being used to its fullest extent, and you're making sure the system integrator isn't building capability that's on the roadmap for the release that you're actually going to go live on, or they're building stuff that actually the vendor intended to be done in a different way. Keeping that tri-party arrangement very tight is super important, and making sure that you've got references that are very relevant, so that you know that the functional capability is there without a bunch of customization from the system integrator.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Great point. And I think it's, you really have to have both. I agree with your caveat. You have to have good software that fits and aligns with your business needs, but you also have to have a strong implementation. And it's price of admission, to use your phrase from before. The price of admission is a software that's going to work and fit your business. Now, to actually realize that value, you're going to have to make sure you implement it well. That's a great point there. So I want to get to this question that I just lost. Where did it go? Here it is. So this is from Ratna on LinkedIn. Says that she loves the analogy of the swimming pool, having done this as a project manager. Although I don't think you meant it as an analogy. I guess it sort of is an analogy, because it actually was a swimming pool client that you were talking about.
No, but I meant it as an analogy too.
Right. But I like where she's going with this. There, she says this perfectly describes the plunge organizations will undertake. Nice description for upper management executives. This message, so they give space and, more importantly, supports for success. I had to take the question off to be able to read the rest of it off the screen here. So any thoughts there, as far as just maybe coming back to that executive ownership thread and why that's so important to the success?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd been, when I came to IFS, I'd been involved in the ERP space for my time at SAP. As I said, I ran the global ERP business. I was involved with dozens of customers in projects. but I'd never implemented an ERP solution for myself. And when we came to IFS historically had been quite fragmented, and we had a number of instances of IFS, but it was effectively a very fragmented, multiple versions, highly customized because of the decentralized approach. When I came in as CEO, we made the decision to implement our own software on the latest version, brand new, greenfields implementation. And my own CIO, a guy called Sal Laher, who is an industry veteran and has been around ERP for many decades outside of IFS. It was an interesting journey for me as a CEO to go on with Sal as my CIO, almost, teaching me what it was like to do it ourselves, really, drinking our own champagne or eating our own dog food, depending on which analogy you want to use. And it was very, very interesting. The number of conversations I was involved in where I would have a business user saying, I need this capability to go live. And Sal was saying, no, you don't. We can do it in this way. We need to go live as we'd planned. And then we will iterate through the coming releases in order to get you what you need. But we can absolutely manage it. And I had many, many of those discussions through the implementation. And the result was that we did a full implementation of IFS. At the time, we were maybe 700 million in revenue, operating in 50 odd countries. We did a full implementation, including HR, CRM, finance, procurement. We did the entire project in 6 months, from the start of the project to full go live, big bang go live in 6 months. And it was about those compromises. It was about interrogating those decisions. And without my sponsorship, it would never have happened. It really took me as the CEO going into those sessions and going, let's listen to what both of you are saying, and going, okay, look, that can wait for the next release. And that's what we did. We then iterated through the coming releases, but we got the go live. As is always the case, 80% of the value was in that first go live, and the project was hugely successful. And the trick is to try and make sure that we push for that executive sponsorship, and drive that kind of 80% of the value from the first 20% of the project.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, and great sort of case study or example of how that works. And just building on this, by the way, we have a series of industry heavy hitters that are rolling into the stream here, so I've got to get to their questions. One is Peter Robinson, who I've known of for a while now. But Peter's comment for you, Darren, is I think it's so refreshing and telling to hear a vendor CEO state that he will consider walking away from a prospective client because of the risk of failure that lies on the client side. Too many end users abdicate all responsibility for their digital transformation to their vendor and system integrator. So I think that's a good point. And I think that's a key thing that he's hitting on, though, that maybe goes a bit further than what you were saying, Darren, which is you have to have executive buy-in and support. But it's also not just having executive buy-in and support for support's sake. It's also just taking ownership and control of the project and not abdicating responsibility to your outside third parties. And I think that's really tempting for a lot of organizations to say, Darren, you've got a solution that's going to help my business. I trust you. You're the expert. Just sort of go figure this out for me and help me just go put the technology in and make my business better. It sounds easy, right? But it's usually doesn't work that way.
It's interesting because if you think about the origins of ERP and the business process reengineering that was a precursor to your first generation of ERP projects, it's almost a new thing where we outsource this responsibility to the vendor and the system integrator. That's not where it started. It started with companies looking at their own processes and really focusing on optimization as a first phase, and then getting technology as an enabler. And then unfortunately, the Wild West emerged, and we got, the multi-billion ERP projects, where the money was made by system integrators that were effectively rewriting the application, and taking it from being a COTS solution to being something that was almost unrecognizable. And that's where, you had a generation of failures. And now we're moving back towards, something that is much more fit to standard and custom off the shelf. But that doesn't mean that the business isn't responsible. And it is super important that the business is working on streamlining those processes to make sure that it fits that there is a meeting of the application and the business processes.
Right, absolutely. And John Reed is on the line. I don't know if you know John, but he's from Diginomica, a very well-known influencer in the space. His comment for Peter that asked that previous question is bingo. There's absolutely a customer responsibility that is often overlooked. And I want to segue into a question from another industry heavy hitter that is all related here. This is from Marcus Harris, who's a software licensing attorney at Taft Law, someone who's been on the show multiple times on this podcast. But his question is, how do you ensure tight vendor management when the customer is inexperienced with implementing software and probably hasn't done an implementation in years? So you've got these executives that think that they can just abdicate responsibility to you or any other software vendor. How do you get that point across to an organization when they haven't done this before and they don't really know what they're doing necessarily?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to two things. One is that something that was done a lot in the industry, again, early on, and I think most vendors would say they still have a practice, but in reality, that it's been eroded, certainly from a quality and capability perspective, is this idea of value engineering and making sure that going into the project that there is clarity on where the value is coming from, whether that value is efficiency or revenue, increased revenue or risk mitigation, whatever it is, that there is a clear value statement and that there is a tight correlation between that value statement and how specifically the application is going to deliver that value. And we do that. And then I think what it is it's a case of making sure, and again, it's quite a manual task, I guess, for my leadership team, and they've had the experience with doing it, which is making sure that the customer is then bought into what is it going to take. And when I say the customer, I'm talking CEO, CFO, ultimate executive sponsor, that they are going to be on the hook in the steering committees, regular catch-ups. And it's interesting because we as I say, I don't want to make it sound like I think that IFS has the answer to everything. We get loads of stuff wrong, and we, as I say, we try and stay humble. But if I think about the number of CEO and CFO interactions that I have today versus what I had in my SAP days, it's very different. And what I saw was that at SAP, it was very much the center of power sat with the system integrator. And the reality is that the system integrator's incentive is to customize the application. Mm-hmm. The more customized the application is, the more hours they're going to build, the more revenue they're going to generate. But as a software vendor, as the OEM, I really want to go live and get on to the next project. That's my imperative. So we tend to push very hard on customers to say, look, if we're not getting the executive sponsorship, if we can't really get alignment on how we're going to capture this benefit, leveraging our business value engineering tooling, and we have a tool which is a digital tool, value assessment, which then goes into our scoping tool, which goes into the application. So we've got a closed loop of how are we going to create value through into the application. If we can't get the executive buy-in into that, then it might not be a customer for us, and we walk away often. And that's because a failed project is a huge challenge. We all know the numbers, right? A happy customer is going to tell far less people than an unhappy customer is going to tell.
Right. Absolutely. And just to build on that point about the closed loop, the value engineering, this is a comment from John, who, by the way, before I get to the comment, he might be as jaded or more jaded than I am and more skeptical of the industry. So this comment, I think, says a lot coming from him. But he says IFS has some of the best value engineering in the industry. Darren knows what he's talking about on this point. We need to have these type of metrics in real-time dashboards. If you can health check on your phone or watch, you must be able to do that with your project real-time as well. So, great point. I think it's, we take seriously, I'm wearing a watch right now that just told me to start breathing, by the way. I just got buzzed that I'm not breathing deep enough. I need to slow down. So I've got my watch telling me this real time that I need to breathe. But yet I'm not taking the same sort of rigor when it comes to a multi-million-dollar digital transformation that will affect my business for years to come. And I find that super interesting.
But I think the thing is that you and I was going to say you'll be amazed. You won't, because I know you've seen this, and many of your listeners and viewers will be able to relate to this. But the number of customers that undertake a project like this without a specific quantifiable business case is incredible. And we see it all the time still. And that's, that's a really terrifying reality. And one that really sets them up for failure. And, you have to be able to measure it. You have to have real clarity on where that value is going to come from.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So a couple of comments here. This breathing really set off some comments here. If you about breathing, Eric, you'll panic. Just relax. I'm trying to relax. I just get worked up in these conversations. It's hard for me to take a deep breath. And then Kyler says, "Congrats, John Reed." Means a lot coming from Eric. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, Kyler. Luckily, she works for Third Stage, so I'll ask her later what she meant by that. Here's just another comment. I'm just sort of hitting some comments that aren't necessarily questions from the audience. But Hassan says, good point in the incentive scheme that
I think he means the SAP SIs get.
Oh,
but it's not just an SAP thing. It is an every system integrator thing.
Yes.
At the end of the day, your system integrators are paid for effort, and the more effort they expend, the more money they're going to make. And that, let me be clear, I'm not bashing system integrators. We have a fantastic group of system integrators. Without our system integrators, we wouldn't be successful. They do by far the majority of our implementations. But ensuring that those system integrators are incentivized correctly and that the process of appointing them is clear is extremely important. And I think the industry's matured a lot. If you think about and Eric, I know you've spoken about this before on one of your podcasts, the biggest failures in ERP. When you look at those are previous generations, right? We're not dealing with that now. Customers are much more savvy now. And hopefully no one's making that kind of mistake.
Yeah. I'd say a lot of them are more savvy, but it's always fascinating to me how I see some of the same mistakes, the same Groundhog Day sort of repeated mistakes now that I saw when I first started in this industry 30 years ago. So I sort of agree with you. I think there is more of a savviness, and more organizations are becoming savvy, but there's still a large subset that aren't.
Maybe not quite on the same scale as the likes of SAP Miller or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good point. The massive $1 billion plus failures, I think those are becoming less common, but it's the moderate failures, I think, where challenges or where organizations.
But it comes down to everything that we've just discussed. It comes down to they picked the wrong tool, didn't make sure that the tool was fit for purpose, picked the wrong system integrator, didn't make sure that the vendor was still on the hook. I think those come down. No executive sponsorship. Probably the three biggest things that they can get wrong.
Right. Now here's I'd love to get your comment or maybe some thoughts on this comment from John. He's, I think, opening a potential Pandora's box here, which I like. He says it's a key point, though. SIs have a responsibility to push back on over-customized projects that accumulate tech debt. My hope is that Southwest Airlines' meltdown will bring even more attention to the problem of technical debt. Maybe explain, what are your views on technical debt in general? We don't have to talk about Southwest Airlines necessarily, but just technical debt in general. What is it? Why is it so important to overcome that? And how do you navigate that whole thing in today's day and age?
Look, I think, let me just comment. I think that a lot of organizations, the scale of Southwest, and we come across a lot of them in our day-to-day operations, they've built their IT stacks over many generations. They've come under enormous pressure, especially in recent times, to build capabilities that the moment demands. So if you think about what airlines have faced during COVID, online booking, online reservations, just a different level of service. It's become very front-end loaded. And frankly, I don't think the hype cycle around CRM and what Salesforce was doing necessarily helped. So massive focus on the front end for maybe a decade now. And what's happened in that time, unfortunately, because organizations have a limit to how much capacity they have to do projects, is that the back office has struggled and has suffered. And I won't name them, but I can think of another airline that I've had some interaction with where, they are a disaster waiting. It's not Southwest. They are an absolute disaster waiting to happen. And the executives know it. And there just isn't the money and organizational capacity to fix it. and it's been okay this year, and it was okay the year before. So maybe we can eke another year out of it, and it'll be somebody else's problem, or a problem that we can face when we're not in COVID or not in an economic downturn.
Right.
And that's unfortunately the reality for loads of customers. I remember meeting with a CIO many years ago who was in a manufacturing environment. He was running an old antiquated system that was out of support. He literally sat there and he said, you know what, I go to bed every night knowing that if the system falls over, we will never get it back up again, and this business will go out of business. I couldn't believe that he was telling me this.
Yeah.
But that's the reality for some organizations. So, I think it's very, very challenging is the answer. And there's no quick fix for it, right? It is just extremely, extremely challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think recognizing the risk, one of the biggest lessons from Southwest Airlines is that they apparently downplayed or didn't fully realize or understand the risk of their technical debt and their legacy systems. And they thought maybe they were saving money by staying on older systems and sweating the assets, as some of those asset intensive industries will focus on. But what ends up happening is you end up spending a lot more money. I guarantee that failure cost them a lot more money than if they would have gone through a transformation or at least started to address their technical debt years ago.
If you put yourself in their shoes and the solution is a multi-year fix, it's very hard to go,
yeah,
I'm going to be the one to start the project. And I'm going to spend all this money knowing that we could be spending this money and it could still fall over during the project. And we're going to spend the money and, get all the trouble. So
right.
it's very hard, very, very hard. And I think there are very few, very large organizations that don't have a ton of this situation. The question is just, are they like a Southwest where, it's so much in the public domain and the impact is so public?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And people heard about it, obviously. I mean, that's a failure that affected a lot of people during the holidays. So there's a lot of emotionally charged responses, understandably, to that failure. So I guess just we could spend hours. I feel like we spent all day on this topic, but unfortunately, I don't think either you or I have the time to do that. But I would like to maybe hear your thoughts on just backing up and knowing that these fallacies exist, knowing that these misconceptions about ERP systems and digital transformations exist. What next steps or what first steps would you recommend to an organization that's thinking about a digital transformation or planning a digital transformation in 2023?
Look, I think I'm going to come back to my fundamentals, right, which is be very clear on why you're doing it. I think any digital transformation has to be underpinned by a strategy, and make sure that the technology is going to enable that strategy, and that you're very clear at a very granular, basic level why you're doing it. And I think that's what it comes back to. And I want to keep it fairly abstract at that level because it's so nuanced by industry. And maybe if we correlate it back to this technical debt question, and I think this might not be popular, but I think Southwest are a great organization, right? I think they're a really smart bunch of people. I think they do some amazing stuff, and I think that they were very unfortunate with what happened. Just as an aside,
Right.
But I think that what I do see, and it's probably the biggest challenge with digital transformation, is that some customers may have some big issue over here. Maybe it's technical debt, but the digital transformation project has nothing to do with that. Now how do I drive a new channel to market, or how am I going to enable servitization, or how am I going to open up my e-commerce capability? That becomes the catchy, exciting thing that people are getting excited about, and they neglect the hygiene stuff. And I think that that's very important. I think we're mature enough now that we need to recognize that we need to get a little bit past the hype cycles and the stuff that sounds sexy, and get into what is it going to take to build a healthy, robust technology platform on which you can evolve your business, because the two are so tightly linked, as was seen in the Southwest example.
Yeah, well said. And in technology and digital transformations don't have to be super sexy. I mean, they can be basic, they can be fundamental. you can focus on automation and streamlining your processes. I mean, even though some might say that's old school, we should be thinking further than that. Well, get that stuff right. And if you do that really well, then you can start thinking about all the sexy stuff after that.
You're 100%. It is like a house. You need a strong foundation, and then you evolve. And I suppose, like with any maturity index, you want to move up. You start at the bottom and move up. And the problem is that too many projects are trying to start at the top and then thinking they can fix it coming down. And it doesn't work that way, because if you can't, if you can't get stock reliably into your warehouses, or you can't keep your manufacturing facility going, then frankly, you don't need a bunch of sales. Tesla maybe is a great living example of that at the moment, where, yes, great innovative model. I'm a big Tesla fan. I own 2 of them myself. But, frankly, supply issues have been forever. So I think it's build the house from the bottom up, get the foundation right, and you will get there. But if you try and start at the end and work back, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. That's well said. And I have a great closing comment here from Sam Graham on LinkedIn. He says he hopes that Darren, as a Springbok, springs back to another session here soon. Well said. Yeah, we'd love to have you back on the show. I think there's a lot we could continue to talk about and cover here. So I really appreciate having you here today. Thanks for being here, Darren.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And how do we learn about IFS? So anyone listening that just wants to learn about IFS, see what products you have, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, go to ifs.com or pop me a note on LinkedIn, or darren.roos@ifs.com. Happy to take your emails, and we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to the audience for being here today. Really appreciate all of your great questions and interaction. Again, this podcast or this interview will become part of my Transformation Ground Control podcast that gets released on Wednesday of next week. And you can find that podcast streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter every Wednesday, as well as on audio podcast platforms throughout the world. So be sure to check it out there. And this live stream that becomes part of my Ground Control podcast is every Tuesday, same time, same place. So be sure to check us out. We do this every Tuesday. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I hope you have a great week, and we will see you all next time.